welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to our panel about technology driving access and impact in special education. So we've got really, I'm going to call you guys an all-star lineup of experts in the sector. I'll just run down the quick who's who here, because we did have some last-minute change up in the panel. So you've got me, I'm Kate Eberle Walker, the CEO of Presence Learning. We've got Vijay Ravindran, the CEO of Floreo. Rebecca Bishop, the VP of Pedagogy at Amplio. Then we've got Jeff Cohen, CEO of FullBloom, Ed Holmes, CEO of N2Y, and Dustin Wahlstrom, the Director of Digital Capabilities at Pearson. So we're going to jump right into the discussion. And Rebecca, I'm going to start with you. So you are a speech language pathologist by training. So I read some survey data recently that 4.5% of SLPs had experienced telepractice, had delivered a service through telepractice before the pandemic. And then another survey taken post-COVID had that number up at 63%. So no question that the pandemic has really driven a significant change in the use of technology, the use of online delivery in special education. My question is, why was it so low before? What were the objections?
That's a great question. Okay, I think good. Okay, so that's a great question. I think that there was a lot of doubt in the field that therapy could be done effectively remotely prior to people experiencing it in a widespread way during COVID. And I think that doubt stems from a couple of different places. When, as communication therapists, we're really interested in this whole human interaction, right? And so this engagement that you have with your student and that relationship building is such a critical part of accelerating their communication goals and objectives, that people were very concerned about putting some sort of medium in between them and the child, a digital medium. And what we learned is that it can be done very effectively, and I think that a lot of people got over their concerns by seeing it work, right? And I think that the proof is in the pudding. Like when you've worked with students and you've seen their progress. We had, in fact, in one district, we have a parent of one of the kids that we serve in one of our districts who's joined our advisory council, and she was describing that her son had been getting school-based services in person for several years with very limited progress, and then once that district contracted with us and the student was seen by our Amplio therapist using the platform, with their weekly therapy, all of a sudden her student started making progress where he had been stalled out for a very long time. And she described this in one of our advisory council meetings, and now her student has basically met goals and is about to graduate from therapy. So.
Yeah, I talk about sometimes these past 2 years were just a massive try it and see period, and the good of that is that a lot of people saw. Dustin, what do you think? So in the area of assessment evaluations, there's definitely been an evolution over these couple of years in how people think about it.
Yeah, and we actually thought that the speech language pathologists were the most open of any of our customers to this. And so we deal primarily in assessments more than teletherapy. And so I think the biggest source of resistance there was just the lack of data, like research data indicating that the tests administered in this format are going to be valid, reliable, yield the same raw scores and scale scores that they would in a face-to-face type administration. And really, when COVID first occurred, I don't think much of that data existed because it wasn't a priority. I think since then, companies like Presence have started to develop some of that data. We have as well, and then I think there's been sort of a see it and we know it works and can feel it's valid sort of response as well.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. So the data, the validation, the research. There's definitely differing opinions about how important is that. How much does research drive the decisions that school administrators are making? How important is it? Vijay, what do you think?
this on? Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, we are one of the companies that sells into both healthcare and education. So we see both sides of the types of standards and the reasons and rationales why companies adopt technology. And one of the things that's been interesting over the life of our company is just how, in general, special education seems to have less standards than the healthcare side in evaluating whether something is effective and safe. And so what's been interesting during the pandemic is, I think, in many ways, the healthcare providers who were essentially put out of business if they couldn't do in-person sessions, in many ways have adopted a lot of the approaches that special education was doing prior, and that in special education, the bigger challenge has been that they're just overwhelmed with all sorts of technology adoption rapidly in this tightly compressed time frame. And so can they, in our case, our technology is virtual reality therapy, and so it's new and different, and depending on how they view the endpoint services, how essential is it to achieve great outcomes for special education when you're going through a pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's an element of that even outside of a pandemic, of there's so much that needs to be done, that I think that becomes the first line, is let's make sure that things are happening. But Jeff, you're running a lot of these programs. What do you think?
Well, we run 95 special ed schools, and I think most of what's driven the adoption of technology is just necessity. And what I worry about is where we're going over the next 6, 9, 12 months. Do we go back to where we were pre-pandemic? Because we don't see a lot of demand for research, right? I mean, in our kind of community in special ed, compliance drives everything, right? And Vijay just talked about great outcomes, but the question is, how do you define great with special ed kids when I think we just acknowledge there are no standards. So for us, we saw this spike in use because of necessity more than a drive for outcomes or accountability.
So the compliance issue is an interesting one, because I think like the research ties to the compliance piece and what we've seen. So historically, when we've made an attempt to demonstrate validity or whatnot through research, it's been generally well accepted. With COVID, I feel like what we saw was that there was nothing at all, and so there was a concern that we've got nothing to stand on if we do it this way from like a compliance perspective. If people were to ask us, that there's nothing to point to, so it's sort of like a nuanced like acceptance or not acceptance of data.
And I think with assessments, that's especially true, because we rely on our assessments to make the students eligible for special education, right? And so if the assessments haven't been proven to be valid in a certain modality in which they're administered, you're going to, question the validity of the results. And so, in that light, what I know a lot of people were doing for some time before we had data that supported the validity of digital administration is they were putting all these caveats in their reports. Given a non-standard administration, the student score was, such and such. But I think that the research and the validation of what we're doing is critical, and the outcomes are critical. And I think the focus on compliance at the expense of student outcomes is a huge problem. And I think, all of our technology should be aimed at solving that problem, because we know what the approaches that we can do that are therapeutically validated in the research. We also know that that's not typically what's happening in the schools in special education, because A, they don't have the time, B, they don't have the resources. And so, for example, in speech and language, to provide therapy in a validated way, there's all of these factors you have to consider. The diagnostic data has to inform the goal has to inform the therapy approach, and then you need to have a very specific dosage of intervention on an intervention pathway. And right now, because of compliance and a lot of other issues that schools are dealing with in special education, typically a student is going to get 30 minutes or 60 minutes a week of therapy, regardless of what the evidence-based approach dictates that they should have in regard to dosage. And we have the opportunity with technology to solve that problem by providing additional opportunities for practicing these skills outside of the intervention session, right? And so students can hop on, an intervention platform in the back of their classroom when the other students are on iReady, for example, and be practicing skills towards their intervention goal on their IEP.
So can I ask a question to that? So I follow all of that. Is anybody asking for that? And I say, I'm not to be critical, I'm just saying, right, are the clients saying, so what can these kids and families do at home? I mean, when we think about these technologies, we really think about them in three buckets, right? One is administrative, right? One is in teaching and learning, and then there's a kind of an umbrella around innovation. Right? Can we prove that things are getting better? I can tell you that most of the focus is on the administration. I think what you guys are doing, right? Because if we can use technology to make life easier in the school, then we're going to get better outcomes as opposed to, so I think the priority becomes administrative technology before what I would call teaching and learning technology.
So the priority from the customer perspective is that?
I am the customer.
Oh, okay. So you're saying you're looking more for administrative tools than tools that are going to drive student learning?
Yeah, it's not that I'm looking more for them. It's just that when we line these things up and think about what's going to drive better outcomes for us, right? What gets in the way is, as we talk about compliance and administrative complexity, and do systems talk to each other? So if you've got a system that eases the burden of folks running the school, you're going to get a better outcome because you're going to spend more time with the kids and engagement.
Yep.
I think that's right. I mean, we've heard special ed teachers talk about having 15 tools in a classroom, and they become sort of an IT manager as opposed to someone who's really working with the kids every day. And necessity brought this about. I agree with your point, but I don't think that means it needs to go back. I would argue if you talk to a doctor today in a small practice, none of them are going to say, I'm not going to do a telehealth visit anymore. Like, that's just changed. Their model is different. They're going to have to do it different going forward. There's a difference between technology and digital learning and remote learning. Remote learning for this group was really, really tough, and I think would be tough under any environment with any technology. It was made possible because of some technology, but now we ought to take what was made possible during 1 year and turn it into something that's really going to have a different outcome. And I agree with you, and we do a little bit of both. We do stuff at the administrative level, but stuff in the classroom with a core curriculum as well. But when you can measure and look at what kind of impact it's having on kids, and you can look at plans and what level of work is being put into them and what kind of progress is really being made against them, that's the ability to say, hold us to the table, make sure that we're actually having the impact that we're supposed to have, and if we aren't, then we've got to make some changes.
Right, and I think that there's an opportunity too that the learning tools can also provide the administrative support that you're looking for. So, for example, if we have intervention pathway for a student that they're progressing through on a digital platform, the data that's collected every time they interact on that platform then becomes the data that is documenting the intervention session, right? And so it's auto-documented for the provider, and they're not having to spend their time documenting that in a separate system. And so, and we need integration of all of those tools to make it happen.
I think you just said the most important word, which is integration. Because all these systems in isolation seem to work well, right? Our teams, when they get, and you just talked about 15 different, right, tools, the question is, do they talk to each other? And that's why I keep harping on administration. Make it easier for special educators to do their job, and you're going to get a better outcome, right? All these systems need to talk to each other seamlessly. Otherwise, you're just creating aggravation in the classroom.
And I think that's the great point. They have to talk to each other, but even if they talk to each other, if they don't actually help the teacher manage the class, then it doesn't even matter that they talk to each other. We have to do both.
So when I think about technology, I do think there are some of these applications that we tend to jump over and think that it always has to be pushing an outcome, driving a limit. And they're really, I think a lot of what technology has done for the past 2 years is deliver an acceptable substitute for an in-person interaction that couldn't happen, right? And that's great, and that has its value. Then there's the administrative technology that you talk about, Jeff, right? How can we make work more efficient by using technology? And in so doing, we can make educators more accessible. We can make them more successful. Then there's this third application, which is technology is going to do something that isn't otherwise possible. And I want to shift the conversation to you, Vijay, and specifically to virtual reality, which you work in. And where do you see that fitting, in here?
Yeah, I mean, I think where we've seen the growth, one part of the last 2 years, we've seen growth because we support telehealth, and virtual reality fills a really important space for special education and teaching social and behavioral skills, where video conferencing falls short. So I think that makes sense to everyone. The other piece, though, and what has been great as a startup that is hungry to listen to customer feedback, and all customers are, but we're especially desperate as a startup, is that 95% of our catalog, which now numbers about 200 lessons, has been driven by teachers and therapists and need. And the need has been in social skills such as our most popular virtual reality lesson is very simple. It's 3 kids at the lunch table, they're talking about something, and the child in VR can practice how to join that conversation and contribute. And it's randomized dialogue, so you can play it over and over again, and it goes through a number of different conversations, and they're getting that socialization. And just to tie it back to what I'm seeing, I'm also a special needs dad, and what I've seen, the biggest challenge, I think, of the pandemic has been my son, who's on the spectrum's loss of social pragmatics because he hasn't been around other kids. And so he has been able to use the medium to learn, but around other kids in person now, he's struggling with jumping into other people's conversations when it's not appropriate for him to jump into, or policing other kids that are breaking rules because he feels, and those are things that he lost because of the pandemic. The power of virtual reality is we can create virtual worlds potentially over time, and while some things can be addressed now by in-person instruction, what we also know is that resources are quite varied. I actually am the benefit of one of Jeff's schools. My son goes to one of the 90 schools, and but not all schools have the kind of resources that his school does. And so VR opens up, and the metaverse in general opens up possibilities of using these new mediums of experiential learning to fill in really important holes, some of which the pandemic was about replacing things we already did, but the future is about identifying the things that we were never doing that need to be taught. In the context of special education, there's a vast ocean of things that we are not doing sufficiently.
Vijay and I were talking earlier today about how important the increased student engagement you see with technology has been. We didn't talk about it much earlier as we introduced some of our products, but customers kept coming back to us and being saying things like, a kid wants to come back to my office for the first time in my entire career. They're happy to come to my office. And it was so powerful for that person. It's powerful for the kids because it reduces anxiety and stigma that goes along with some of that testing. And then from a psychometric perspective, one of the big threats to the validity of tests is just effort and engagement. And so to the extent that kids are, if you're testing someone's cognitive skills, and they're doing poorly because of something you're not trying to measure, like they're bored or just paying attention to something else in the room, that's a threat to test validity. And I think when people know students are engaged, they feel confident that the results they're getting are painting a more accurate picture of the people they're working with.
Can I beat my drum a little bit louder here about the administrative thing? Because Vijay and I have had a chance to talk, and so I think in isolation, the programs we're talking about are fantastic. The question is, what do our educators do with them, right? So when I look at what Floreo is doing, I look at it from the perspective of training teachers, right? And what they should expect in their engagement with kids with special needs, right? Because I worry that, if you take a great VR program into one of our schools, yes, the kids, they may do phenomenally well. The question is, what do the educators do with that, and how does that layer out or scaffold into the rest of the program? I think we've got to solve that first.
Can I answer that? Because from my perspective as a provider, I think that I'm really excited about this technology because the applicability is so broad in my mind. What it does is it bridges the gap. So for some kids, you're going to be directly working on their goals and objectives in a setting like that, like, for example, a social communication goal. For other kids, the applicability is that step towards generalization. So what we are so challenged with in the schools is, we're teaching these students these skills, we're getting them up to speed, and then they go back to their home environment or the community or even their classroom, and they're not sure how to use that skill in that environment. And so this can provide a bridge to that, right, where they're practicing it in a very safe environment, regardless of what the skill is, and then they can feel confident going into that real person environment.
Yeah, I think those things are true, and Jeff's point is true in that, to give you an example to back up Jeff's point, one of the biggest challenges for adoption for us, besides the obvious of, you need equipment, you need to be willing to use this technology that's new to you, is that the number one feature ask among schools is when will you allow multiple kids simultaneously to go into VR to get instruction? Because they don't have one-on-one breakout time, or if they do, it's like such precious minutes of time that it's just incredibly contended for. And so I think that fits in. I think the other area that we haven't talked about is the IEP itself and how the administration of the IEP is such a vital part that has to be tied into everything that's done. And if we can, we added a really simple feature where you can search on IEP objectives to find lessons in our catalog. Hugely popular because it's just the IEP kind of governs so much of what happens.
So I think the building software for IEP writing, administration, tracking. That's perhaps I guess I don't know the history of software in special education well enough, but I would guess that that's really where a lot of the first businesses and technology initiatives came out of, because there's so much that needs to be connected and organized. And Ed, your company is very much at the center of all of this. So, I'm curious, when you think about, all of the offerings that you now have for administrators, for educators, for students, do you see the IEP as it being at the center? Should it continue to be at the center of what we all build around?
I do, and I would say not just the IEP, but really any plan. So that could be a behavioral plan, that could be an IEP, that could be other things. But the plan should be dictating really where we're going with trying to educate and inform and grow that student. And the more that we connect everything we're doing every day to what we decided was necessary for that particular student, and we wanted to measure against at the end of some period of time, is really the best way we're ever going to have any real view into outcomes. Are we really impacting it? Because IEPs for a long time were written for the purpose of, government stuff. They were written for the purpose of getting funding. They were written for the purpose of making sure you wrote down something so you didn't get sued. So they were compliance oriented. We're trying to make sure you turn that into something much bigger than that. Like, we should be turning it into, how do you take this plan, write it uniquely for that student, and actually follow up and ensure you deliver on it at the end of the year.
And I think that all of that is, I would second all of that. And the other piece I would add is that we have the opportunity with technology then to complete and make it a full cycle, where we can then impact how student goals are written because of the data that's being collected with our intervention tools. And so, yes, we're using recommendation engines, and we're able to select learning pathways based on IEP goals, but then we're also able to modify those goals and update those goals for those students because of the data that we're collecting. And so it can be a full cycle, and it should be, but it has to be integrated.
And I think that ties back to the issue of integration and interoperability that you guys were bringing up, right? Because if you're sort of like a home base that's pulling in all of this information, such as what we're generating and other products are, then without that, it's very messy for the end user.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that you also have when you actually go through the process and you define what the goals are and you write those down, and then you think about, okay, we achieved something that year and now we're going on to the next grade and we're going to the next teacher. How does it get handed off? And what's the collaboration between the student and the parent and the teacher and the para and everybody in administration? Like, how are we connecting that? And so what the tool that we've built, I won't make this commercial, but the idea is about collaborating with all of those people, not just in writing of the plan, but in the execution of the plan. If you can then collaborate as you're moving to the next grade, so you collaborate with the next teacher and you're writing it in a way that is building on top of something. So we're scaffolding in a way that doesn't say, okay, that happened last year, let's start over this year.
So what about, I mean, the creation of the goals in the plan stems from evaluation. And, you know, Dustin, the work that our companies have done together has very much been in you know, the first category of technology. Let's create something equivalent to traditional assessment methods and validate that it can be done with technology. But where is it? I mean, from some of what you've said today, you know, I sense that you see a future where there's different ways, or maybe better ways to evaluate a student by using tech.
I'm a psychologist by training, so this will probably be spoken like a true psychologist. But you know, the whole concept of like construct validity and all of those different things is that our understanding of cognition and different psychological constructs that make up the basis of those reports is derived from our ability to measure those things. So, you know, it's this sort of bootstrapping mechanism that you have to do to sort of like put together this picture of what intelligence means, or, you know, whatever the construct it is that you're interested in. So to the extent that you can start to use technology to measure things slightly differently, it actually like impacts your entire understanding of all of these constructs that we're interested in the human brain and all sorts of other things. Like a super basic example would just be something like reaction time. So reaction time can't be measured very precisely in a paper world, but in a digital world, all of a sudden it can. And I think there's plenty of evidence in the field of psychology that, you know, reaction time variables can add important insight into, you know, various types of constructs. So that would be the tip of the iceberg. And then you're talking about, you know, brand new tests altogether. And I think we're sort of knocking on the door of doing all those things.
And I think just to piggyback on that, like if you think about, beyond reaction time, you can look at things like eye tracking for attention, right? And because that's such a huge impact in testing, and even like voice analysis to look at, you know, stress levels of the student during the testing session. So there's so many other, you know, avenues to explore in that regard that really could make an impact on how we deliver the assessments.
The other thing that I find interesting with data play is that, I mean, having watched my son go through therapy, they make small improvements over long periods of time. And so traditional methods often can't actually see that, and parents often give up because they don't see progress fast enough. And I think we have an opportunity with all of these new capabilities coming in where those small incremental improvements can be tracked, can be communicated, and that can then lead to the cycle of parents supporting the efforts happening, which I think is huge. And, you know, over the course of, you know, many years of education, you know, the ceiling for where the kid can get by adulthood can be greatly raised.
So any other thoughts on the parents as stakeholders, and what do parents want? Do they want, you know, schools sending practice home? I mean, technology does facilitate more connections from what's happening in the school to what could happen at home. Is this something that, you know, we're going to hear parents ask for more?
All right. So I think it's a good question, but it's a very general question, right? I can tell you, our parents, right, of the kids in our schools, they don't want to be called during the day. That's what they want, right? They don't want to hear from the school during the day. These are parents whose kids have been disruptive in class, right? Haven't been able to be successful in a traditional classroom. And so they're used to getting called at work and saying, your kid's a problem, right? And the public school really didn't know what to do. So when they don't get a call, that is success. They know their child is engaged, right, and moving forward with us. Would some of them want us to send some work home, right? Maybe, right? But that's why I say this is part of the problem when we talk about special education. You're talking about a very broad range of students and how we engage with them and what success looks like really does, is different from student to student.
Yeah, definitely not one answer.
Yeah, I think that's very true. That was my first response to that question was it's going to be really varied. But I would say that we can think about solutions to this problem that don't impact the parents and pull them away from their daily life while their kid is at school. So for example, if a student is working in an intervention platform and then there's an app that the parent has on their phone that's connected to that data can be fed and just send a quick text message, oh, hey, guess what Johnny did today? Here's a tip of something you can ask him about today after school. And it can be that simple, and it draws the parent into what's happening during their child's day, but it doesn't require anything about them. It doesn't interrupt their work day, and they can look at it when they have time, and they can feel included.
I think one really simple win for technology would just be better communicating the results of an IEP to parents. They're so complicated and difficult for people to understand that I think there'd be many ways that technology through data visualization or things like that could make it easier for people to understand.
Yeah, I've lived both sides of this in that our startup initially was a direct-to-family product, and then I think I learned a lesson that I should have understood from the beginning, given that I was also a special needs parent, which is that it's extremely stressful and you don't have capacity to take on a lot of other responsibilities, including being the teacher. And so I think awareness and confidence that you're doing the right thing, I mean, to build on Jeff's and Rebecca's point, every parent is looking for their kids to succeed and reach their full potential, and knowing that you made a good decision in choosing this school, this program, and having that reinforced, and that spans the IEP, it spans how their day went. I would say the other piece, in addition to, on the side of kids who have behavioral challenges, is also that they want to go to school in the morning, because that's extremely stressful if they don't want to go to school.
And I think the other side of it too with parents is, and you spoke to this a little bit with the IEP involvement, is visibility, right? So general ed LMS platforms, all of them have parent portals. In special education, we really don't have anything equivalent. And parents should have visibility on what's happening with their student at any time that they want. They're used to that now. They expect it because that's what exists in general ed. And they haven't had the opportunity to have that same visibility in special ed, and we need to provide it.
So let me just second that, because when I think about, when you talk about parent engagement, typically parent engagement with certain cohorts of special needs kids is all around a negative event, right? And what you're talking about is potentially balancing this, right? Look what your child is doing. Like, look where they are succeeding. You can see that, as opposed to this was an incident at school today, or there was an altercation, or that. And that's what parents of special needs kids are used to getting called about.
Well, and I can attest to that because I also have a special needs child, and when he was in early elementary grades, there was a lot of behavior issues, and I was called constantly, but for negative things. But as he's progressed through his education, his needs have changed. But we happen to have a teacher this year. She sends me a text every single afternoon about something good he did, and it makes my day. Like, it is the number one thing that I look forward to at the end of the day. So.
It is interesting that with the population that probably needs it the most, and with how much information we have, and you as a psychologist would probably have more of it than all of us, about what positive behavior and positive reinforcement does for people's development, how long we've spent talking about what's wrong. And I think if we can find ways to more and more talk about what's right and what's working and what's progress and what we should do more of, we've all read the book that says find something you're good at and do more of it, not find something you're bad at and try to be better at it. I think there's a level of how do we find a way to really think about celebrating the positives, both with the child and the parents and everybody around them, just so we create a little bit more energy around the progress they're making.
Second that. So we're down to our last 5 minutes or so. So let's talk about what's next. What are you seeing that you think is really cutting edge, or that you're really excited about and incorporating into your own work? Let's just go down the line.
Well, I mean, I think in my world, which is VR, the headset technology is rapidly evolving, and in particular, you have, in beta now, finger level hand tracking, which I think opens up for fine motor, gross motor skill development. So in that occupational therapy context for special ed, there's all sorts of new applications that are possible. There's also new hand controllers that provide force feedback, including glove-like controllers. And again, in the context of OT and fine motor, really excited about that. And then retina level eye tracking in there. So I think that opens up a ton of opportunities around helping with social skills, but also being able to provide data on areas such as anxiety that I think will provide data for other systems in the future.
I think that what I'm looking forward to is kind of circling back to something we talked about at the very beginning, which is that in special education, we don't really have a lot of standards to compare progress to. And what we have now is an opportunity with when our students are engaging on these digital platforms and data is being collected on the platforms, we now can build this very robust data set so that we can understand what's expected. We can understand what baseline is, we can understand what accelerated progress looks like. And then we can modify our systems and our interventions and our tools accordingly. And that is going to dramatically change how service is delivered in the schools.
So there was a number of things that came to mind, but I'm going to do a little bit of an advertisement for Vijay here, because when we think about VR and where we can use VR, it's really around training our staff, right? And unfortunately, you show me let me say it in the positive way. You show me a well-trained, right, educator, and I'm going to show you a set of good outcomes. And the problem is, when we look at our ABA programs, the RBTs that are interacting with kids with autism, I mean, those behavior techs, oftentimes, this is the first job they've ever had in their lives. They've had maybe 40 hours of training, and then they're providing therapy to kids. And that therapy is only as good as those behavior techs are trained. And then I sat, with Vijay and looked at these simulated worlds, and you realize you could put these behavior techs into a simulated world where they are constantly getting trained on the interactions or the reactions that they're going to receive from children.
It's like a flight simulator.
It's like a flight simulator, and but think about the expertise they can develop and how quickly they can do it and how cost effectively they can do it, and that's what we're really excited about.
I'm probably going to be more of the simpleton with my answer. I feel like over the last couple of years, we accelerated growth to digital use in education and really brought the education industry forward probably 5 or 10 years in 2 years. I feel like maybe the thing I'm most excited about is it looks like it might stay. And I think it's really important that it does stay. If it doesn't, special education has its impact, but general education, I think, will have the same impact. I've laughed with people before about, boy, we've made technology so good, there's no such thing as a snow day anymore. I live in Atlanta, so there really aren't snow days anyway. But it would be terrible to take away some of these moments when kids get to be kids and go outside and do their thing. And so I think there's a time for technology to be the answer, and right now I feel like we've accelerated a great deal. We've got to find a way to make sure we have that and get the momentum continuing into the future and not sort of stepping back 5 years.
I live in Texas, and I think we get more snow days now than when I lived in South Dakota. So I'll second a lot of what Vijay said, but then I'll just add that the collaboration that technology provides and the ability to allow people to aggregate gigantic data sets, to me, is very exciting. So we're co-collaborators on a grant with UCLA and a number of other universities that are pulling together clinical data from all sorts of different measures, but a lot of our tests, and the scale of that data set and what we've been able to pull together in a year or 2 years is greater than I think all of the data we've ever gotten within Pearson in all of our history prior to that from clinical samples. So that's really exciting. I think it's going to provide all sorts of insights that we haven't seen before.
All right. Thank you all for sharing your thoughts. Thank you for all of the work that you're doing to push the sector forward. And it sounds like VR for the win. So go Vijay. Thank you all for being here, and thanks everybody for listening.